So hello everybody, I'm Representative Deborah Gonzalez of House District 117, and I'm so pleased to be here with Avery Murdy, my current campaign manager. And we just wanted to take a few moments and give you a little recap of what actually happened during this legislative session.
Yeah, and I'm glad to be here, so thanks for including me.
Thank you.
So the legislative session, there was a flurry of last-minute activity. And I know that we've received a lot of calls and emails from people wanting to know what were some of the things that happened. And so we thought perhaps maybe the best way to do it would be to do a legislative recap. So I'd like to start with, what is your first impression as a freshman legislator? What did you think of this legislative session?
The truth?
Is always the best.
Oh my God! I have to say, most people know this about me, that I am not a politician, right? So this was my first time in politics. So there was a steep learning curve to just get a sense of what's going on, who's who, what the processes are, learn that, and also make sure that I was getting enough time to look at the bills. I'm very fortunate that I was appointed to the Judiciary Non-Civil Committee, where all the bills that deal with crime and drugs and most of the immigration bills come to. And so it was a committee that met quite often and for long hours, because this is really important law.
So let's just recap on that real quick, as some people may not know. What were the committees that you were on this legislative session?
So one was Judiciary Non-Civil. The second one was Code Revision, which was an interesting one because what it does is tries to go back to old laws and sort of bring it up to modern code, or delete them, remove them from our code section, which some people might not believe that we actually do that. But, we actually cleaned up some interesting things. And the third one was intergovernmental coordination, and that one really dealt with local laws.
Okay, so on the local level. So one of the things I know that everybody is excited to hear, what were some bills that you supported that passed? Well,
the first one is the budget, and we're really excited about the budget because we finally got to get something that we had been fighting for in the legislature for years, and that is that QBE was fully funded for the first time in 30 years.
What does QBE mean?
So QBE is Quality Basic Education, right? And it is a formula on what we use in order to get funding to schools, how much we're going to give to each of the districts.
The bare minimum, right?
Bare minimum, yeah.
That's what...
And I want to preface that because I think that's a good point when people say, okay, so we got the QBE funding. What does that really mean? Well, it means that the austerity cuts are over. We had a $167 million gap. That is now over. And in the district, we're going to be receiving a little more than $3.5 million between the 4 counties in District 117.
And that came last minute, right?
That came on the last day that we passed the budget, which was sine die.
Right. So your district, 117, which is Clark, Barrow, Jackson, and Oconee, I believe you said like $3.5 million coming to the public schools?
Yeah, coming to the public schools.
And that's an additional $3.5 million that was taken away previously.
Yes, and I know that people are going to say, but that's not enough. But it is a major step forward because, again, we've been cutting public funds for decades, and this is the first time we fully fund QBE in 30 years. So we're really proud of that. The other thing is we had some of our state retirees really passionate and sending out those emails about COLA, which is the cost of life adjustment, right? And again, it did not pass the COLA, but a 13th check did pass. And I know that's not the same as having the COLA, but they weren't left out altogether, and we'll fight again next year. And the last thing that I want to mention about the budget, we did add that $18 million for school safety programs, and that was a big deal. And, one of the things that I talked with Chairman Terry England, who's the appropriations chairman, is please make sure that some of that money goes into bringing counselors and therapists into the school. And one of the things that he assured me as we look through the language is that schools will have a lot of flexibility as to how they can use that money. So now it's up to the school boards and us as the people, that those school boards relate to let them know that this is what we need. We need counselors in the schools to help our kids.
So education affects our community. And on the topic of our community, I'd like to kind of pivot here to HB 384. Can you tell us a little bit about that bill?
Yeah, so this is a bill that started off under another number and another author, Representative Scott Holcomb, but it's the idea that domestic violence victims would be able to terminate their rental leases without being financially penalized. And that's a big deal. And so we're very happy that that bill actually got through, because one of the problems, and Representative Holcomb spent over a year talking to, rental management companies, trying to get their buy-in so that they would not oppose this bill. Eventually, it went through this number, HB 384, and under Chairman Ballinger, Mandy Ballinger. But we're excited that it got passed. So now we're waiting for the governor to sign it.
And so basically, like you said, it just lets the victim of domestic abuse be able to safely terminate their lease and find a new place without penalty.
Find a new safe place, and not only for the victim, but for the victim's children.
And so what about an adoption bill?
Yeah, so this was a big deal between last session and this session. And so the idea was last session, the House passed an adoption bill, what they call a clean adoption bill. And the Senate last session added this RFRA amendment, Religious Freedom Amendment, and that sort of killed the bill. So one of the first things that we did in this session was get back to that bill, and we were very happy to report we got a pretty clean adoption bill. The RFRA language was taken out, and so we were able to pass it in the House and the Senate, and the governor has signed it. So that's pretty cool.
That term has been used quite a bit, a clean bill, and most people probably know what that is. But for those who don't, what exactly does a clean bill mean? What does that look like?
I think that's important to note. So part of the process of getting bills passed through committee and on House or Senate floors is that people can add amendments to these bills. And amendments, from what I learned, may not have anything at all to do with the main gist of what that bill is. And so it can be quite dangerous. An otherwise great bill might all of a sudden become poisoned by an amendment. And so we're always vigilant and always looking to make sure that those amendments are not added unnecessarily. And that's what we call, when we have a clean bill, we don't have those amendments added.
And so that adoption bill was HB 159.
Yes.
Right? Okay.
Very important.
So then what about criminal reform? Was there anything that happened there this session?
Yeah. So Governor Deal has made it part of his priorities during his 8 years to really work on criminal reform. And this session, we had the 6 of what were considered 7 proposals that we had to consider. We did pass it, and one of the good pieces of this criminal reform actually has to deal with bail bonds, and you've probably been hearing a lot about that in the news. But this is a good thing, because what we don't want is we don't want wealth-based detention, right? The idea that somebody can't be released because they can't pay a bond, or that it's going to bring them more into poverty because of that. So this was actually a good part of that bill.
Okay. And I had heard something about distracted driving. What was that bill?
Yes. So HB 673 was quite an interesting bill when it came through the committees, and it had some controversy, which people really wouldn't think of as having controversy. You want safety on your roads, and the argument seemed to be, is it really hands on the wheels or eyes on the road?
So what was the final outcome, though?
The final outcome was that we did pass it. We passed it. It was different from the way that it was first proposed. So, for example, some people might have heard that you could only swipe once to answer a phone. That was taken out because there was no real way to enforce the swiping, right, of one time to turn it on and one time to turn it off. But keep in mind, it did pass in the House. It passed in the Senate. It now goes to the governor's desk, as all these bills that we've been talking about. So the governor, one thing that people don't know is the governor has a certain amount of time to sign the bills.
Right.
Any bill that he does not sign within that time automatically becomes law.
So if he were to sign this, what would that mean for somebody like me who's driving on the road and I get a phone call? What can I do? What can't I do?
Well, you want to make sure that you have some kind of hands-free device that you can use with your phone. So the idea is that if you're driving and a cop sees you with a phone on your hand, you're dinged. Okay? That's pure enforcement, just having the phone in your hand. So you have to make sure you have some kind of device that you can put on your phone. And this was one of the arguments that was made, is that what is the cost of that advice? And is this going to be something like a regressive tax to people who really can't afford, and their argument was, well, it's going to be less than $25, but we also know $25 can be a tank of gas.
Yeah, it can be.
So that was one of the controversies that had come up with that bill.
And speaking of controversies, I do know that there was really a lot of give and take and some agreement and disagreement among many groups on medical marijuana. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So right now in Georgia, we do have a registry of a certain list of diseases that patients, if they suffer from that, can get what's called a registry card saying that they are entitled to get this medical marijuana. And this is an oil. This is what we call THC oil. So it's not like they're going to smoke a joint or weed, okay?
So it's not like we usually think of it.
No, it's not. Okay. It's not the way that you usually think of it. And in fact, we call it medical cannabis more so than just medical marijuana. But two things came up with the bill. One was to be able to add PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and it started off as chronic pain. It ended up in intractable pain, something that could be medically defined. So those two got passed as adding to the registry. But the other part that we were shooting for was to be able to get cannabis cultivated and dispensed in Georgia. So right now you can be on the registry, but you can't legally buy the oil here in Georgia.
That seems like it'd be very difficult for somebody who had chronic pain and had some of these conditions and needed it. Doctor prescribed it, but you can't.
And right now, the doctor can't prescribe it. All you can do is get on the registry. And so
you just get on the registry.
You just get on the registry, which sort of doesn't make sense. I'm on the registry, but I don't have access to it, right? But what we did get passed is, for the first time, a study committee that'll say, we're going to really look at the cultivation and dispensary. We're going to look at what's happening in other states. We're going to look at those laws. What can we do? And a piece of this has to deal with allowing research universities to really study the effects of this once and for all, instead of having all this supposition, does it work, does it not work, against the opioid addiction, things like that, to really get like a University of Georgia to come in and say, okay, let's do the research, let's find out once and for all, scientific based, no more opinions.
So by passing HB 764, that actually gives us some hope going forward in Georgia.
Absolutely. And I can tell people, there is a group of representatives, bipartisan, Democrats and Republicans, who are working very diligently on this. Now, our chairman, Alan Peake, is resigning this year, unfortunately, but there are others of us who have committed to working on this particular issue.
Okay. I know that one of the things that's on a lot of people's mind is also transit. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so HB 930 did pass the House and Senate this year. And, one of the things that I like to mention, because I've already gotten the question, but that's only 13 counties related to Metro Atlanta. How does that affect me in Athens? How does that affect people in Macon? How does it affect people in Savannah? Why should I even care? Well, one of the reasons to care is that the chairman, Kevin Tanner, who is the author of this bill, has already made a commitment to what he calls urban centers outside of Atlanta, in connecting them to Atlanta. And so now that this bill is passed, he wants to be able to go to those urban centers, Athens is one of them, and start talking about how do we connect Athens to Atlanta now that we're having that extension. And that's why it's important to us. We need to be prepared by looking at what they're doing in Atlanta and how we can become part of that.
So for those who aren't familiar with the wording of the transit bill, what is just like a good elevator pitch, that we give to kind of explain it in a nutshell? Like, how's it going to affect them in Athens?
Well, the transit bill is about public transportation. It's not about roads. It's not about bridges. It's about this idea of buses and trains. And, is there going to be other technology like Uber and Lyft or autonomous vehicles? How do these things then become part of offering a full, comprehensive public transportation system, which is required because as we stand as the number one state for business, this is something that businesses need. They need to get their workers to work. How are we going to do that? And that's what this transit bill is really focused on.
And I know we always talk about Athens and Atlanta, but it actually is not just Athens and Atlanta, right? It's a corridor. It's incorporating Barrow and Jackson and Oconee. Right.
I mean, if you think about it, every county, every space in District 117 will be affected eventually.
Okay. What is this STEAM education that some of us keep hearing?
Okay, so many people, there was a time that everybody talked about STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math.
Math, right.
Now we have what's STEAM, and that A is art. And it's the recognition that education is not complete if we don't also include the humanities and arts and cultural studies as well.
So the idea of a well-rounded student, right?
Exactly. Okay. And so what this resolution does, and we did pass it, this was authored by Representative Darshan Kendrick, is the idea to encourage, right, this push to STEAM education and the well-rounded student.
Okay. In terms of like students and transportation, some of the stuff that we've talked about, a lot of this has been a little more Athens focused. And so if I turn now perhaps to some of the rural areas, I know that there were a lot of constituents who were contacting you about this, what was called the satellite bill. And there was like broadband and what was the whole issue there with this broadband?
So, I always bring it back to calls that I got from constituents who said, I've got to go to a McDonald's parking lot so my kid has access to the internet so that he can do his homework. And this has been happening all throughout the state of Georgia. There are areas that are they have no connectivity. And
or if they do, it's very poor.
Very poor, and it breaks up and it doesn't hold enough. And, we know how important the internet is, from doing homework to filling out an application for jobs to finding out, just what you need to know every day, weather, news, etc. And so this is a really big deal. So we did pass a couple of bills, SB 402, which we call the broadband bill. And not just for rural communities, but also any community who does not have access to the internet. And then we had SB 426, which really focused on EMCs.
And what are EMCs?
EMCs are those energy cooperatives.
Cooperatives, okay.
Yes, I want to get the name right. It's the cooperative. So we have like the Jackson EMC and Cobb EMC. And what this does, they actually own most of the poles that, you see the cells on, right? So that we can get access to the internet. And this bill allows them then to become internet providers, since they already have some of the infrastructure there. And since most of them tend to be in rural communities who aren't served now. So this was about expanding the scope of accessibility.
So the idea behind these bills in terms of broadband and internet connectivity is that if you are in an underserved area right now, these bills were designed to help expand access and opportunities for these areas to get internet or better internet.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
And then I'd kind of like to wrap up our bills passed section by asking you about this particular one called Marsy's Law. Can you help explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So this is Senate Resolution 146, and it also had a counterpart Senate bill. And this is actually something that's been adopted throughout the United States. And it's the idea that when a crime occurs, there's a defendant, right? And then there is, the plaintiff tends to be the state. It's the state who is then bringing that defendant. And one of the key parties to all of that is the victim. And they are not considered anything more than a witness. And so Marsy's Law is trying to say, the victim should have certain rights. For example, they should be notified if the defendant goes out on bail or is released.
I think that's a good point, because in all the CSI and crime shows, you always hear about the defendants, right? And they should be afforded rights. But I do think you have a point there that oftentimes the victim perhaps is overlooked in terms of like their rights too.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting because one of the things that we discussed in the hearing, again in the judicial non-civil meeting, was this idea of balancing the defendant rights right? Because you are innocent until proven guilty, but also acknowledging that victims are part of what has happened and therefore should be part of some of the processes. So we think we came up with a very good balance between the two.